The war drums had been silent for an hour. That was when you knew death was coming. 15-year-old Thomas Harper pressed his back against the splintered door of the abandoned trading post, his breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air. Through the cracked window he could see them, 50 Lakota warriors arranged in perfect formation, their faces painted for what could only be vengeance. The boy's hand shook as he gripped the rusted knife he'd found in the debris, alone, defenseless, surrounded by enough warriors to burn down half the territory. The lead warrior raised his lance, and Thomas closed his eyes, waiting for the war cry that would signal his end. Instead, he heard something impossible, the sound of grown men weeping. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie. 3 days earlier, Thomas Harper had been doing what he'd done every morning for the past 2 years since his parents died, searching through the ruins of Fort Morrison for anything that might keep him alive another day. The abandoned military outpost had become his home after the cholera outbreak claimed his family and left him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a threadbare blanket his mother had sewn. Winter was coming early to the Dakota Territory, and Thomas knew his chances of surviving it were thin as morning frost. At 15, he was too old for the orphanages back east and too young for most honest work. The other survivors of the outbreak had moved on to established towns, but Thomas had nowhere to go. This desolate stretch of prairie between two hostile territories had become his entire world. Every morning, he'd wake in the ruins of the old supply shed, wrap himself in his mother's blanket, and venture out to check his rabbit snares. The few coins he'd managed to earn trading pelts to passing travelers were long gone, and his last can of beans sat empty beside the cold fire pit. Thomas had learned that hunger was a patient enemy. It would wait, growing stronger while you grew weaker, until the day when standing up became impossible. As he made his usual rounds through the abandoned fort, Thomas carried with him the weight of complete isolation. The nearest settlement was 3 days' ride through hostile territory, and the Lakota had been increasingly active in the region. Just last week, he'd seen smoke rising from the direction of Miller's ranch, though he'd been too afraid to investigate. The boy had taught himself to read the signs of the wilderness, how to tell which berries were safe, how to predict storms by the way the grass bent, how to remain invisible when riders passed through. But mostly, he'd learned how to endure loneliness so complete it felt like a physical wound. On this particular morning, very fast-paced delivery, clipped and urgent, with sharp breaths, whispery undertone, but no dragging. Words snap out quickly, almost like bullets. Minimal intonation, dry and matter-of-fact. Quick pauses only for dramatic tension, then immediate continuation. Feels like an old cowboy telling the tale before the fire burns out. As Thomas checked his snares near the frozen creek, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice water. The crying of an infant, weak and desperate, carried on the autumn wind. Following the sound, Thomas discovered something that would test every survival instinct he'd developed. Hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees, wrapped in animal hide, lay a native baby no more than 6 months old. The infant was alone, shivering violently, its lips already showing the blue tinge of hypothermia. Thomas looked around frantically for any sign of the child's parents or tribe, but the surrounding area was empty except for the whisper of wind through dying leaves. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Thomas realized that without immediate warmth, the child would be dead within the hour. Every rational thought screamed at him to walk away. taking in a native child during a time of increasing tensions between tribes and settlers was beyond dangerous. It was suicidal. If the Lakota found a white boy with one of their children, they'd assume kidnapping or worse. If settlers discovered he was harboring a native infant, they'd brand him a traitor or sympathizer. But looking down at the dying child, Thomas saw something that transcended race or politics. He saw helpless innocence that reminded him of his baby sister who died in his arms during the cholera outbreak. The memory of her final breath, weak and rattling, made his decision for him. Thomas scooped up the infant and carried him back to the supply shed that served as his home. The baby was so cold that Thomas could barely feel a heartbeat through the thin chest. Without hesitation, he unwrapped his mother's blanket, the only thing of value he possessed, his only reliable protection against the brutal Dakota winters, and wrapped it around the shivering child. For 3 days and nights, Thomas shared his meager shelter with the native infant. He fed the baby water from his cupped hands. "Don't know where your family is, little one," Thomas would whisper as he held the child close. "But I reckon we're both orphans now, so we might as well look out for each other." But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. On the 4th morning, Thomas woke to the thunder of approaching horses. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, he could see dust clouds rising on the horizon, the kind that meant dozens of riders moving fast. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the organized formation of a war party. Thomas clutched the native baby tighter, his mind racing through impossible choices. He could try to run, but on foot with an infant, he'd never make it 100 yards. He could attempt to hide the child and claim ignorance, but the baby's cries would give them away. He could surrender the infant and hope for mercy, but he'd grown to love this child like family. The war party reached the ruins of Fort Morrison just as the sun crested the horizon. Thomas counted at least 50 warriors, their faces painted with the stark black and red patterns that meant they'd come for blood. At their head rode a man whose presence seemed to command the very wind. Chief Standing Bear, war leader of the Lakota Nation. Thomas had heard the stories about Standing Bear. They said he'd never lost a battle, never shown mercy to enemies, never left a wrong unanswered. If this infant was his grandson or nephew, Thomas knew his death would be neither quick nor gentle. The warriors surrounded the supply shed in perfect silence, their weapons ready but not yet raised. Chief Standing Bear dismounted and approached the crude shelter where Thomas waited with his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. "White boy," the chief called out in heavily accented English, "we know you are there. We know you have what belongs to us." Thomas's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm here. Bring out the child." This was the moment Thomas had dreaded since finding the infant. Every instinct told him to beg, to grovel, to throw himself on the mercy of men who had little reason to show any. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. Thomas stepped out of the shed, holding the native infant gently in his arms. The baby was still wrapped in his mother's blanket, clean and healthy, and obviously well cared for. As Thomas approached the circle of warriors, the child gurgled contentedly, tiny fingers grasping at the morning air. Chief Standing Bear's eyes moved from the baby to Thomas, taking in the boy's ragged clothes, his thin frame. "This is my grandson," Standing Bear said quietly. "He was taken 3 days ago when soldiers attacked our winter camp. His mother died protecting him. We thought him lost forever." Thomas nodded, understanding flooding through him. "He was alone when I found him, cold, hungry. I did what I could." Standing Bear stepped closer, and Thomas could see the war paint up close. Streaks of red that looked like tears, black lines that cut across the chief's face like scars of grief. This was a man who had lost family and had come expecting to find only death. "You could have left him to die," the chief observed. "White settlers would have praised you for letting one less Indian survive." Thomas looked down at the baby, who had grabbed onto his finger with a grip that seemed to anchor him to the earth itself. "He's just a baby." Didn't matter what color his skin was, he needed help. The circle of warriors murmured among themselves in their native tongue. Thomas caught fragments of what might have been surprise or confusion or debate. Chief Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. "Show me where you kept him." Thomas led the chief into his makeshift shelter, acutely aware of how pathetic it must look to these proud warriors. The shed was barely weatherproof, with gaps in the walls stuffed with rags and newspaper. His few possessions, an empty can, a rusted knife, a pair of worn boots, spoke of poverty so complete it bordered on desperation. Chief Standing Bear examined the crude bed where Thomas had slept beside the infant, sharing his body heat through the freezing nights. He picked up the empty water container that Thomas had used to feed the child, noting its cleanliness despite the squalid surroundings. "You gave him your blanket," the chief observed. "Your only blanket." Thomas nodded. "And you? How did you stay warm?" The truth was that Thomas had barely slept for 3 nights, shivering in the bitter cold, while the infant remained warm and comfortable. His lips were chapped from the exposure, and his hands showed the telltale signs of frostbite beginning to set in. "Didn't matter much," Thomas said quietly. "He needed it more than I did." Chief Standing Bear studied the boy's face for a long moment, reading something in his features that seemed to surprise the hardened war leader. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made the very air seem to shimmer with importance. "My grandson would have died without your care. You saved the last of my bloodline, the future of our people. And you did this knowing it could cost you everything." Thomas didn't know how to respond to words that heavy with meaning. He simply held out the baby, offering to return him to his family. But Standing Bear stepped back. "Keep him a moment longer." The chief turned and spoke rapidly to his warriors in Lakota. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could see the effect they had on the assembled men. Warriors who had arrived painted for battle began to lower their weapons. Some removed their war paint entirely, smearing the red and black designs until they looked like tears running down weathered faces. And then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the fiercest warriors Thomas had ever seen began to weep openly, their tears falling to the prairie earth like rain after drought. Chief Standing Bear turned back to Thomas, and the boy was stunned to see moisture in the war leader's eyes as well. "Do you know what you have done, white boy?" Thomas shook his head, too overwhelmed to speak. "You have shown us that there are still good hearts among your people. You have proven that kindness can exist between our races. You have given us hope that this war might someday end, not in victory or defeat, but in understanding." The chief gestured to his warriors. Many of them were now dismounting and approaching with their hands open in gestures of peace rather than clutched around weapons. These men rode here expecting to recover a body and take vengeance for another crime against our people. Instead, they found a miracle, a white child who would rather starve and freeze than let a Lakota infant suffer. Standing Bear gently took his grandson from Thomas's arms, holding the baby close and whispering words in his native tongue that sounded like prayers of gratitude. Then he handed the child to one of his warriors and faced Thomas directly. "What is your name, boy?" "Thomas Harper, sir." "Thomas Harper,
You have shown greater courage than warriors twice your age. You have displayed wisdom that eludes the leaders of both our peoples. And you have proven that the Great Spirit works through hearts that know no boundaries of race or tribe. From his horse,
Standing Bear retrieved a magnificent buffalo robe decorated with intricate beadwork and painted symbols. He placed it around Thomas's thin shoulders, and the warmth that flooded through the boy's body felt like salvation itself. This belonged to my father and his father before him. It has never been worn by anyone outside our bloodline. Today, that changes. But Standing Bear wasn't finished. He gestured to his warriors, and they began unloading gifts from their pack horses. Blankets woven from the finest wool, jerked meat that would last through the winter, silver jewelry crafted by master artisans, and warm clothing that would protect Thomas from even the harshest Dakota blizzards. You shared your last blanket with our child. Now, our people share their abundance with you. The transformation was overwhelming. Thomas had awakened that morning, expecting another day of scrounging for survival in the ruins of an abandoned fort. But the greatest gift was yet to come. Standing Bear placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder and spoke with the authority of prophecy. From this day forward, you are under the protection of the Lakota Nation. Any who harm you, harm us. Any who help you, honor us. You have shown us that a white heart can beat with the same rhythm as a native heart, and that is a lesson our children's children will remember. As the war party prepared to depart, taking the rescued infant back to his people, Standing Bear made one final gesture that would echo through the generations. He removed a sacred eagle feather from his own hair and placed it in Thomas's hand. This feather carries the prayers of our ancestors and the hopes of our descendants. Keep it close and know that you will always have family among the Lakota people. The warriors mounted their horses, but before they rode away, very fast-paced, gritty Western voice, faint Southern drawl, very fast-paced delivery, clipped and urgent, with short breaths, whispery undertone, but no dragon. Words snap out quickly, almost like bullets. Minimal intonation, dry and matter-of-fact. Quick pauses only for dramatic tension, then immediate continuation. Feels like an old cowboy telling the tale before the fire burns out. Each man approached Thomas with a gesture of respect. Some touched their hearts, others offered brief nods of acknowledgement, and a few spoke words in Lakota that Thomas somehow understood meant gratitude beyond words. As the dust settled and silence returned to the prairie, Thomas stood alone in the ruins of Fort Morrison, but he was no longer truly alone. The buffalo robe around his shoulders carried the warmth of acceptance. The supplies surrounding him spoke of generosity beyond measure, and the eagle feather in his hand connected him to a family he'd never known he needed. Word of Thomas's act of kindness spread throughout the territory like wildfire. Traders carried the story to distant settlements where it was retold around countless campfires. The tale reached military commanders, government officials, and newspaper editors in far-off cities. But more importantly, it reached other native tribes, who began to see Thomas's story as proof that peace between the races was possible. Within months, the abandoned Fort Morrison had been transformed into an unofficial meeting ground where native tribes and white settlers could trade safely under Thomas's protection. The boy who had once been the loneliest person in the Dakota Territory became a bridge between two worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict.
Years later, when historians wrote about the end of the Indian Wars, they would point to treaties and battles, to the coming of railroads and the pressure of westward expansion. But those who lived through those times knew the truth, that real peace had begun with a 15-year-old orphan who chose to share his last blanket with a dying native infant, and the war chief who honored that kindness with tears of gratitude. Sometimes the smallest gesture can change the course of history. Sometimes mercy is the greatest form of strength. And sometimes very fast-paced delivery, clipped and urgent, with short breaths, whispery undertone, but no dragon. Words snap out quickly, almost like bullets. Minimal intonation, dry and matter-of-fact. Quick pauses only for dramatic tension, then immediate continuation. Feels like an old cowboy telling the tale before the fire burns out. When the world seems divided beyond repair, it takes the pure heart of a child to show us what unity looks like. The eagle feather Thomas received that day was passed down through his family for generations, a reminder that courage and compassion can triumph over hatred and fear. And in the Lakota Nation, the story of the white boy who saved Standing Bear's grandson became a sacred teaching, proof that the Great Spirit works through all hearts that choose love over fear. Would you have shared your last comfort with a stranger's child? Tell us in the comments if you believe that kindness can still bridge the deepest divides. And remember, in a world that often seems torn apart by differences, we all have the power to choose compassion over indifference, just like young Thomas Harper did on that cold morning in the Dakota Territory. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be truly human.
And click on the video on the screen to discover another tale where a single act of courage changed everything, with a twist so powerful it will restore your faith in the goodness that lives within us all.